Good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. Oh my gosh, that's so loud. I have the privilege of working with a tremendous team of librarians in the Hispanic Division who work to improve access to diverse publications written in Spanish, Portuguese, English, and many indigenous languages of the Americas. It is our collective honor to welcome Mexican writer, not just novelist, Cristina Rivera Garza, and translators Suzanne Levine and Aviva Kana, and our moderator, Manuel Cuellar. I wanted to do that in Portuguese, I'm sorry. To discuss the Taiga Syndrome, the 2018 English language translation of Cristina Rivera Garza's El Mal de Taiga. For the librarians in the room, this has nothing to do with the Taiga Forum, other than the reference to the far reaches. It is important to me to use this moment to acknowledge Catalina Gomez, who is our curator of the Archive of Hispanic Literature on Tape in the Hispanic Division, as well as Anya Kreitney and Rob Casper from the Poetry and Literature Center. And I just learned from Rob that we have a connection through the Huntington Endowment, so thanks for that information. Along with the Mexican Cultural Institute and the Dorothy Project, these three individuals have led the effort to make this event possible, of course, with our panelists. Before I pass the microphone, because we like to pass microphones in these formal events, to Anya Kreitney, program manager in the Poetry and Literature Center, I'd like to share a quote and a reference to another work authored by Cristina Rivera Garza. It's called The Unusual, a Manifesto. Writing is a community-making practice. If we write with others. Inescapably. If we write about others, even when we write about ourselves in small diaries that remain hidden and locked in drawers, constantly borrowing from the language we share with entire and varied communities at once. When we write, we acquire debt, a real material debt, with the practitioners of such languages. It is an immense debt. The same could be said about library work and likely translation. It is a community-making practice, which we do with others, describing and sharing writing, always borrowing and continually building on an already enormous debt. Thank you all for being part of this community today, and know that you are welcome in the Hispanic Division. We'd love to tell you more about what we do. And with that, I will pass the mic to Anya.
Thanks, Suzanne. We're thrilled to join forces with this. I just have to say, this podium is severe. I can see just heads here. Anyway, we're thrilled to join forces with the Hispanic Division. It's a pleasure to build such valuable work with such committed and talented colleagues. It's a real thrill. As Suzanne mentioned, my name is Anya Kreitney. I'm the programs manager at the Poetry and Literature Center, which is housed just upstairs. Our lovely guests here were upstairs in our space earlier today. And our center is charged with highlighting the ongoing and sustained value of poetry and prose, so an important charge. We celebrate all things literary through public readings such as this one, lectures, symposia, festivals, along with a bevy of online features, most prominently the Archive of Recorded Poetry and Literature, which is sort of a twin to the archive that Suzanne just mentioned. We're also the home of the U.S. Poet Laureate. You may know this year's laureate, Miss Tracy K. Smith, who is now in her second term. And we just learned there's a connection. Christina has translated a poem of Tracy's from Life on Mars, so we're in good company today. This year, Tracy is holding reading and listening sessions in rural communities all over the country as part of her project American Conversations. She's also just launched a podcast in association with Minnesota Public Radio and American Public Media titled The Slowdown, so we encourage you to please take a listen. And of course, I've just scratched the surface of our center's offerings, so please come back, come to more of our events, and take a look online. We're reachable at loc.gov/poetry, and you can also add your name to the sign-up sheet by the door. And I just want to say what a thrill it is to work again with our colleagues here. It's a deep pleasure for us to honor writing in translation. We feel strongly about it. And so without further ado, I want to hand it over to my dear friend Catalina, who is going to talk a little bit about the flow of the event today and also introduce our lovely guests. Catalina.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you, Suzanne. We're just also, I want to say that we're so thrilled that Suzanne's here. This is her second week as the chief of the Hispanic division, and we are just excited, we're really excited to welcome her to the library. So I'm Catalina Gomez. I'm a reference librarian here in the Hispanic division. And I just want to say that this event, it was really cool how it came about, because Cristina was actually doing research in our reading room here for one, I think for one of her, for the comic books. Okay. Yeah. And I was on my reference duty, and I saw her. I'm like, oh, you are Cristina Rivera Garza, and we should do an event with you here. And it was a lot of fun, and we also love the division to celebrate translation. And I learned that the Taiga Syndrome was going to be published this year, so we thought it was a perfect opportunity to celebrate this book. This is one of 3 events that Cristina is doing in Washington this week. Tomorrow she has a lecture at the Mexican Cultural Institute at 6:45 p.m. It's actually going to be in Spanish, and it's going to be about writing in Spanish in the United States. And this Friday, October 19th at 3 at the University of Maryland College Park, she'll be giving another lecture titled Jose Emilio Pacheco, Our Great Disappropriationist. For more information, check out the Mexican Cultural Institute's website at www.instituteofmexicodc.org. So before we move on to the program, I just had some some housekeeping items and announcements. If you all could please silence your cell phones, and we also want to let you know that we're filming the event, so if you participate in the Q&A section of the program, you're giving the Library of Congress permission to have your voice on the video. I also want to briefly announce that Cristina's recording for our Archive of Hispanic Literature on Tape was recently made available online. Every September, the Hispanic Division releases 50 recordings of this collection for online streaming, and this year's batch includes Cristina's 2015 recording, where she's actually reading from the book we're here to celebrate. For those of you who don't know about this archive, it's a 75-year-old project that we curate here at the library. Consists of close to 800 audio recordings of Luso Hispanic poets and writers reading from their works. It spans 32 countries and more than 10 languages, and we have recordings with figures like Borges, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Juan Rulfo, Gabriela Mistral, and many more. We have a flyer about the project and the entrance, so whoever is interested, you can find out more. And now onto the program. The event will consist of 2 sections, a bilingual reading where Cristina will read from the Spanish edition of today's celebrated book, El Mal de la Taiga, which was published by Tusquets, Mexico in 2013. And then translators Suzanne Levine and Aviva Kana will read excerpts from the English translation, which was published this year by the Dorothy Project. The second portion will be a conversation between Cristina, Suzanne Gil, and Aviva, moderated by Manuel Cuellar from the George Washington University. Cristina Rivera Garza was born in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, Mexico in 1964. She's the author of 6 novels, 3 collections of short stories, 5 collections of poetry, and 3 nonfiction books. Her books have been translated to multiple languages, including English, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Korean. She has a PhD in history from the University of Houston, and her dissertation was the departure point for both Nadie me verá llorar, one of her most well-known novels, and the historical nonfiction book La Castañeda, on Mexico's most infamous mental hospital. After a few years at the University of California, San Diego, she is now a professor of Hispanic Studies at the University of Houston, where she has been spearheading the first PhD program in creative writing in Spanish. The recipient of the Roger Calvois Award for Latin American Literature, as well as the Ana Segers Prize, she is the only author who has won the International Sor Juan Inés de la Cruz Prize twice, in 2001 for her novel Nadie me verá llorar, translated into English by Andrew Hurley as No One Will See Me Cry, and again in 2009 for her novel La Muerte Me Da. Suzanne Gil Levine has received many honors for her translations of Latin American literature. She is the author of Manuel Puig and the Spider Woman, His Life and Fictions, and The Subversive Scribe, translating Latin American fiction. Her editions include the Penguin paperback classic series of Jorge Luis Borges' essays and poetry. Aviva Kana is a PhD candidate in Hispanic literature at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her work focuses on Latin American literature, gender, translation, and applied linguistics. Her translations have been published in Review, Literature and Arts of the Americas, Pan America, Latin American Literature Today, and Fiction. And finally, Manuel Cuellar, our moderator. He's an assistant professor of Spanish and Latin American literatures and cultures at the George Washington University. His research and teaching focus on Mexican literary and cultural studies with an emphasis on race, gender, and sexuality. His current book, manuscript, Assemblages of a Festive Nation, Queer Embodiments and Dancing Histories of Mexico, studies dancing bodies in public spaces in order to privilege movement as a means to examine questions of citizen formation and national belonging. Please join me in welcoming our participants.
Hello everybody. This has been already a great day, very touching. I'm very grateful for your generous welcoming to this institution, to this place that I really adore. I spent many hours doing research here, and as Catalina was saying, my forthcoming book is very much based on research that I conducted right here in the documents of this institution. So I feel absolutely privileged and lucky to be here with all of you, with the generous people from the Mexican Institute, professors from the University of Maryland, and these two wonderful translators. I just adore Jill and Aviva, and we'll talk about the whole process in a little bit. What I'm going to do right now, I'm going to read in Spanish a section of the first book of this novel, and a section also of the 7th chapter of this novel. They are not very long chapters, and then Aviva and Jill will be reading the translation into English, and then we'll get to the conversation. Okay. Lo mismo. Que habían vivido ahí, me dijeron, que esa era la casa, y la señalaban con una especie de timidez que bien podía confundirse con el respeto o con el terror. Sus dedos apenas lograban asomarse por las bocamangas de unos abrigos pesados y negros. El olor a carbón bajo sus brazos, las uñas sucias, esos labios tan resecos. Sus pupilas, que se movían con discreción hacia el objeto señalado, no tardaban en regresar a su punto de partida, la mirada frontal. ¿Qué buscaba ahí en realidad? Eso era lo que me preguntaban sin atreverse a preguntar. Y yo, que tampoco lo sabía con exactitud, acoplaba mis pasos a los suyos y los seguía de regreso a la comarca entre la nieve. No era una casa, eso habría que decirlo desde ahora. Yo hubiera descrito lo que vi esa mañana de inicios de otoño como una cabaña, tal vez menos, una casucha. Era, en todo caso, una estructura habitacional hecha de tablas de madera y pedazos de cartón y abundantes ramas secas. Tenía un techo, en efecto, de 2 aguas y un par de ventanas que a falta de vidrio recubrían con un plástico grueso y transparente. Tenía el aire de ser un último refugio. Daba la impresión de que más allá solo quedaban la intemperie y la ley de la intemperie y el cielo muy azul, tan alto sobre la intemperie. Recuerdo el frío sobre todo. Recuerdo las mandíbulas apretadas, los puños dentro de los bolsillos. Habían llegado ahí, según mis datos, a inicios del invierno. Lo había colegido así porque la última comunicación que emitieron había salido de una oficina de telégrafos de un poblado fronterizo que quedaba a unos 200 kilómetros de distancia. El telegrama, dirigido al hombre que me había encargado la investigación, afirmaba escueta, pero solo indirectamente, que no pensaba en regresar jamás. Cuando decimos adiós, ¿qué es lo que saludamos en realidad? Tomé el caso porque siempre he sentido una debilidad achacosa por formas de escritura que ya están en desuso, el radiograma, la taquigrafía, los telegramas. Fue cosa de tocar el papel amarillento y empezar a soñar. Las yemas de los dedos sobre las arrugas de la hoja, el olor a viejo, algo guardado. ¿A quién se le hubiera ocurrido hacer algo así? A esos dos, por supuesto. De entre todos, solo a ellos dos. ¿Desde qué lugar tan lejano en el espacio, tan lejano en el tiempo, había partido este puñado de mayúsculas? Y sobre todo, ¿qué habían saludado en realidad? ¿Qué cosa o cosas habían aceptado en sus vidas? Quise saber eso desde el inicio. Quise entender. Recuerdo el lobo. Vi, en efecto, un lobo enorme y gris sobre la nieve. Vi sus fauces abiertas, sus ojos, sus garras. Vi el hilo rojo que partía de su huella y se deslizaba luego entre la nieve hasta enredarse en el tronco del abeto. Vi el abeto, majestuoso. Trepaba entonces el hilo rojo por sus ramas combas, por sus perennes hojas aciculares, hasta alcanzar en lo alto las ramas verdes de otra conífera. Fue por eso que observé el cielo, gris también, repleto de gruesas nubes abigarradas. ¿Cuál gris? El gris de 10 minutos antes de la tormenta, naturalmente. No oía, no podía escuchar nada, pero vi cómo el lobo se preparaba para saltar sobre algo, vi cómo la saliva, sus dientes, sus labios. I'm jumping to chapter 7. Algo de su lengua en mi lengua. Que todo esto ocurría a inicios de otoño, haría falta aclararlo, por ejemplo. Que el viento entre los cabellos, gélido ya o aproximándose. Que la alberca, la curiosidad que producía o el terror. Una alberca en medio del bosque y a través de la bruma. ¿Qué cosa en realidad era eso? Todas estas imágenes y luego el largo trayecto hacia todas esas imágenes que se llevó a cabo, en efecto, durante los últimos días del verano, que ya se convertían poco a poco primero y de súbito después en el otoño. Antes compré los boletos de avión, los boletos de tren, los boletos de barco o barcaza. Hice reservaciones de hotel, de hostal, de cuartos pequeños, cuando fue posible hacerlo desde lejos electrónicamente. Contacté amigos que a su vez se pusieron en contacto con amigos que poco a poco me fueron aproximando a la taiga. Hacía falta, como siempre hace falta, un traductor, un informante. Y mucho antes de llegar, mucho antes de partir incluso, tenía ya entre mis contactos al hablante de su lengua que se encargaría de ponerlo todo en mi lengua. Recuerdo las muchas frases que repetí esa frase, el hablante de su lengua que se encargaría de ponerlo todo en mi lengua. La sonrisa, que no la risa, el gesto de intriga o de desconsuelo, el suspiro o esta otra cosa más serena. En el informe que le escribiría al hombre que había tenido 2 esposas, le pediría que tomara en cuenta que nada de lo escrito había ocurrido tal cual. Nada de lo escrito ocurre nunca tal cual. Repetiría eso o algo parecido. Le pediría de una cierta manera cuidadosa y elegante, asumiendo que él estaría al tanto, pero sabiendo también que este tipo de cosas pasan desapercibidas casi siempre, que tomara en cuenta que había mucho tiempo entre alocución y alocución. Deténgase, le pediría. Lea como si hubiera muchos minutos, incluso algunas horas, entre las palabras pronunciadas primero y luego las palabras escritas, transcritas, las frases. Le diría, por ejemplo, que cuando yo escribiera, cito, les pregunté si tenían electricidad y ellos me respondieron mostrándome una vela encendida. Debía considerar que la pregunta la había enunciado yo, en efecto, pero que antes de recibir la respuesta, que tardó en llegar, el traductor tuvo que hacerme repetir la pregunta un par de veces y luego tuvo que enunciarla él también un par de veces hasta que los habitantes de la comarca de la última taiga pudieron entenderla y a su vez contestarla. Y luego hubimos de esperar, el traductor, los habitantes, yo misma, a que la acción, el hecho de mostrar la vela encendida y el hecho de pronunciar a la vez las palabras «no tenemos electricidad» pasara por el entendimiento y luego por la sorpresa y finalmente por la incredulidad. Recuerdo la imagen del abismo. Recuerdo, sobre todo, las palabras «fin del mundo», todas juntas, las muchas imágenes de mi propia ciudad, ese sitio lleno de espacios oscuros que había yo también dejado atrás. El traductor me esperó en el aeropuerto de la última ciudad grande que visitaron antes de internarse en los pequeños poblados de la Taiga. De ahí, de esa ciudad fronteriza, había salido el telegrama «Nunca tan cerca lo lejos». Supuse que ellos habían aterrizado en el mismo aeropuerto y que abrochándose el abrigo y enredándose la bufanda en el cuello, se habrían dado algo de tiempo para mirar el cielo. Nunca supe si eso fue alguna vez cierto. Nunca tuve idea de cuánto tiempo les llevó conseguir el chofer que los llevó ¿a dónde? Supuse que habrían dormido ahí, en esa ciudad de 200,000 habitantes, donde se extrae petróleo, pero no estaba segura de nada. De lo único que sí tenía evidencia era que de esa ciudad había partido un telegrama lleno de mayúsculas. Un telegrama y una carta. También. Una carta muy breve, escrita a lápiz por una mano que se presentía entumida o cansada. Jamás lo lejos arremetió tan cerca. Las variaciones continuaban.
That they had lived there, they told me, in that house, there, and they pointed it out with an apprehension that could easily be mistaken for respect or fear. Their fingers barely peeked out from the cuffs of their heavy black coats, the smell of ash under their arms, dirty nails, dry lips. Their eyes, having discreetly moved towards where they were pointing, quickly returned to their original position, gazing straight ahead. "What are you really looking for?" they asked without daring to say so, and I, who didn't exactly know, followed their steps like a shadow back to the village over snow-covered trails. It wasn't really a house, I should say first. I would have described what I saw in that morning at the beginning of autumn as a shack, maybe not even, a hovel. In any case, it was a habitable structure made from wood, cardboard, and lots of dry branches. It did have a roof, a ridged roof, and a pair of windows covered in thick, transparent plastic instead of glass. It had the air of a last refuge. It gave the impression that beyond was only open space and the law of the wilderness and the sky so blue, so high, above the wild. I remember the cold. Above all, I remember the cold. I remember my clenched jaw, fists deep in my coat pockets. They had arrived there, according to my information, at the beginning of winter. I had come to that conclusion because their last communication came from a telegram office in a border town about 200 kilometers away. The telegram, addressed to the man who had hired me to investigate the case, said briefly and somewhat obliquely that they were never coming back. What are we letting in when we say goodbye? I took the case because I have always had an all-consuming weakness for forms of writing no longer in use, radiograms, stenography, telegrams. As soon as I placed my hands on the faded paper, I began to dream. The tips of my fingers skimmed the creases of the paper, the stale smell of age, something hidden. Who would set out on such a journey? That man, of course. Out of everyone, only those two. From what place, so far away in space, so far away in time, had this fistful of capital letters been sent? And what were the two of them hoping for? What had they let into their lives? That was what I wanted to know. From the start, that was what I wanted to understand. I remember the wolf. I saw him, an enormous wolf, gray against the snow, his jaw open, his eyes, his paws. I saw the red thread that extended from his tracks and slithered through the snow before momentarily getting lost in the trunk of a fir tree. I saw the fir, so majestic. Then it climbed, the red thread, through the warped branches, through the evergreen pine needles, until high above it reached the green branches of another conifer. That was what made me look up at the sky, also gray, filled with thick, jumbled clouds. What shade of gray? 10 minutes before storm gray, of course. I didn't hear anything, couldn't hear anything, but I saw that the wolf was preparing to pounce. I saw his saliva, teeth, lips.
Tongue to tongue. Among other things, I should explain that all of this occurred at the beginning of autumn, that the wind blowing my hair was icy, nearly freezing, that the pool caused curiosity or terror. A pool in the middle of the forest through the mist, how could this be? All these images and the long journey toward these images ended, essentially, during the last days of summer, already turning little by little at first, then all at once, into autumn. Before, I had bought the plane tickets, the train tickets, the passage for the barge. Whenever it was possible from far away, electronically, I had made reservations at hotels and hostels for single rooms. I contacted friends who put me in contact with their friends who little by little brought me closer to the Taiga. It was necessary, as it is always necessary, to find a translator, a guide. So, long before I arrived, even before I left, long before I left, I had among my contacts a speaker of their tongue who would transmit everything into my tongue. I remember how many times I repeated the same phrase, tongue to tongue, a speaker of their tongue who would translate everything into my tongue. A smile, no, a laugh, a look of intrigue or distress, a sigh, or something more serene. In the report, I would, did I continue?
Yeah.
I continue?
I think so.
Oh. In the report, I would write for the man who had had 2 wives. I would ask him to take into account that nothing had happened exactly as I claimed. I would tell him that nothing happens as it is written, and I would constantly repeat this or something like it. I would ask him in a careful and tactful way, assuming that he knew, but realizing also that these types of things are always hard to bear in mind, to take into account that there is a great distance between speech and writing. Take your time, I would remind him. Read as if there are many minutes, even hours before the words spoken and the ones written down, transcribed, the phrases. I would tell him, for example, when I wrote, I asked them if they had electricity, and they responded by showing me a lit candle. That he should realize I had, in fact, pronounced that question, but before I received the answer, which came much later, the translator had made me repeat the question several times, and then had said it several times himself until the inhabitants of the village and the Taiga could understand it and answer. And then we had to wait, translator, inhabitants, myself, until the action showing the candle and articulating the words, we don't have electricity, was heard and understood, first with surprise and then, finally, disbelief.
Well, now I have the privilege of starting the Q&A, asking them some questions, and then I'll pass the microphone along for the questions you may have about this wonderful reading. I think this is a novel that is such timely and crucial, especially considering issues of translation and translating women authors. I was captivated by how, Cristina, you engage issues of gender, writing, sexual labor, extractive capitalism, and ways of, this is something I'm obsessed with, ways of relating others and relating to others. And this is a lyrically haunting work. So thank you for that wonderful reading of the 3 of you. And the first question, because we're talking about the Taiga here, is, can you please tell us how you first conceived this project, just to get us started? In other words, what inspired you?
Yeah.
What led you to the Taiga?
The Taiga is such a faraway place, huh?
Mm-hmm.
At least if we take into consideration our position in the globe.
Indeed.
Right now. I was thinking more and more about escape. And I was trying, one of the challenges that I wanted to go through, and I want to take readers with me, was about how far away I could get in terms of the writing, in terms of telling the story, in terms of telling a story of escape, how far away I could get with my readers. So at what point the story might become unintelligible. So the challenge for me was to move away as much as I could from known familiar territory, and I was trying to approach places, languages, landscapes as alien to me as possible. But and I wanted to use language that was able to embody that strangeness while keeping my reader still with me, while creating a sense of strange, unique familiarity between us. I suppose that was the main issue. And I was living in Mexico back then, and most of the writing, I think, I did it in Mexico. So I guess the more far away place that I could think of was the Taiga, and mostly the winter, that kind of winter. Yeah.
Certainly. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'll get to the translators. And this is, as you've heard, multisensorial creative work. And I think it really transcends the written word. And if we look at the different versions of the translation and the original work, the original comes with drawings by Carlos Maike, and it really enhances this sort of atmosphere Cristina is trying to capture. But also, both editions come with a suggested playlist, and I wanted her to know, I was playing it this morning for my students, yes, what they were thinking about this. I wanted to find out how, whether you could comment on this creative process. Did you think of the list first? Because it really enhances that sense of eeriness that you certainly heard, right? Or did you think of it at the end, or while you were writing it?
Well, thank you for those questions. And yes, in fact, the original version in Spanish comes with some eerie drawings that I really love. And then we kind of decided not to include that in the English version, but perhaps in the second edition we might be able to include them. I'm just enunciating that right now.
We tried to convince him, right?
Yeah, we did our best. Yeah, that's for sure. But let me see. I'm the kind of writer who has to be enunciating the words that I'm writing as I'm writing. So every time that I'm writing in a room, it sounds as there's a conversation going on, because I'm actually enunciating out loud every single word. And I think the reason why I've been doing that is because I'm concerned. I want my body. I want the words to go through my body, and I want to measure my breathing pattern and try to accommodate, to fit all those words within my own breathing pattern. So if I write a sentence that is too long or too convoluted, and I'm not able to pronounce that in a way that is pleasing to my ear at that point, well, that sentence has to go, obviously, right? And so I do that, and because of that, I think I've gotten very used to my own, very easy, very at ease with my own breathing patterns. But when I was writing this book, and as I told you earlier, I wanted to go through this experience of unfamiliarity, and I wanted to take the reader to these other faraway places in terms of the landscape and in terms of the writing as such, the selection of the writing and the rhythm of the sentences and the use of punctuation signs and things like that. So what I said from the beginning, I need to interrupt, I need to interfere my own breathing patterns with something else. And so I look for some of these songs and some of these pieces, and some of them have words in them and stories in them,
Yes.
but many of those are just instrumental. Some of those are a good collection of electronic music, contemporary music, some music from the area as well. And I used to play them as I was writing these different chapters, and I wanted to pay very close attention to their own rhythms and the sound and the words, and I wanted to have this external element interfering with my own breathing patterns. So if I wanted to achieve, to embody that sense of unfamiliarity, of being in foreign territory. I assumed that by doing that, I was also placing myself in the writing process as such in that foreign territory as well. But I think the songs are really good too, and some of the videos are actually quite good, very eerie. And so there was also that connection between what I was imagining and the kind of landscape I was trying to convey in these pages.
Wonderful.
You actually translated one of the titles, because I didn't, it was the ritual reality was ritual virtuality.
Is that right?
Yeah, and I thought that was interesting that you know, unconsciously did that. I mean, I myself, I feel very irresponsible because I didn't listen to these until after I translated. I know, because I know.
The second edition.
I mean, we have to do a second edition.
I actually wanted you to share with us and the audience a little bit more about the process of translating. How do you decide to translate this novel? And part of the question has to do with the political and ethical states of translating from Spanish to English, and also questions of the market, since we'll be talking about like the editor wouldn't include the drawings, etc., right? And how that shaped your ability to translate and publish these creative works. And I'm thinking specifically of this Dorothy project, the publisher who focuses on women writers.
Yeah, they're a wonderful small press. They've done Nell's Inc., for example.
Mm-hmm.
They choose their writers very carefully. Oh, now it's on. They choose their writers very carefully. Does that make a difference? I'm pretty loud anyway.
Oh,
yeah, okay. Oh, well, maybe that's a better one. Here. Well, you heard me anyway, I said. Yes. So yeah, so it's a very wonderful small press, and I mean, just speaking about small presses, I'm just jumping in here. They've really amazingly survived and have proliferated despite the marketplace being so challenging. So it's something really to admire. You know.
I was just going to jump in. I wish maybe I don't wish I had a better answer, but originally I wanted to translate a different book of Cristina's.
Which one?
La Cresta de León.
Oh,
yeah,
yes.
the Iliad Crest. I originally contacted her about that book, and someone was already translating it, and she sent me this book, or said, "What about this one?" So I immediately sat down and read it, and so it was sort of random, I guess, but which I think kind of fits with the type of book. And I said, all right, I'm going to do it. And then one thing I wanted to say just about what Cristina was saying about reading it out loud, I found that really interesting because I don't know how many people in coffee shops I harassed trying to get them to listen to a certain sentence that I was saying in my head, and I just had to say it out loud. I mean, I think with translation, you have to say it out loud. It just bounces around your head. It just doesn't work. So yeah, a lot of talking to myself, but then a lot of coffee shop harassment and harassment of friends, whoever would listen.
Yeah, so that began, and it really began as Aviva's project, right? And you were doing that for also for your emphasis,
right.
For your work as your doctoral.
Mm-hmm.
So it didn't begin as a marketplace.
Definitely didn't.
It began more as an academic and intellectual project, and then Dorothy project somehow, I don't know how they stepped in, but they stepped in.
I sent it.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah. But Cristina had recommended that publisher, and I had sent it to some places before, and I think that it really was a pretty ideal fit with just their mission statement.
Well,
it could be written about your writing.
I was very familiar with Dorothy Project. It's a press that I love the catalog. Mm-hmm. I love the authors, and I read several of the authors, especially the work by Renee Gladman. And I was thinking, if this work belongs in any press in the United States, it would be that one. Mm-hmm. So from the very beginning, I thought about Dorothy Project, and I was very set on that one. And when Aviva was asking me, where should I send it, I said, well, Dorothy Project, obviously. and so it turned out that it was a good call.
Mm-hmm.
Is that why you chose this book in particular?
Yeah, because that's the one that fit, I think, their catalog, the conversation that they are engaging with in terms of experimentation and cross-genre writing, in terms of writing of women, not only from the United States, but also from other places. And in addition to that, they have very recently translated the work by Leonora Carrington, which is one of my also favorite writers, who is not from Mexico but lived in Mexico for quite a while.
I wanted Jill and Aviva to share with us your approach to translation. By that I mean your method or theory, and what it was like to co-translate this work.
Well, I mean, again, the project began with Aviva, and for me, translation is editing anyway. So, I mean, it's just, that's what writing is too. Writing is rewriting, it's editing. So, I sort of stepped in, as the director, I suppose, on the academic setting of the project, but also as an editor. And so, obviously, we talked about sound, rhythm, language. We were looking for, I was looking to make this because when you look at Cristina's writing, it actually has a very, it has an impact. I mean, in other words, it's very, straight to something, it's very concise. And so I felt that, the English had to be very tight and at the same time have sensuality, have, images that were very clear. So it was a very difficult project. I mean, we had some, maybe we should talk about some of our, challenges, specific challenges, which would be really good. Well, and I think maybe you want to begin with what you liked. But I know that what made Cristina very happy was when we came up with tongue to tongue, because that originally said something in his tongue, algo en su lengua. ¿Cómo se llama? Algo en su lengua que, ¿cómo es?
Algo de su lengua en mi lengua.
So, algo de su lengua en mi lengua. Okay. To me, it was suggestive. In other words, it's
yes.
Language into language. Okay, but wait a minute. Something into something. So basically, tongue had to be in there, right? Mother's tongue or whoever's tongue had to be there. So basically, and to say in English, something, it's weak. But if you say tongue to tongue, I think the reader gets the idea. And then, of course, you see the repetition of the phrase as the phrase was in the text, right? So I think it, titles are very curious. And the titles of her chapters are amazing. They're really, I mean, she has a sense of humor. She doesn't, I know she reads very serious, but she's very muy seriosa esta mujer. But the thing is, but she's very funny. And so these titles are sharp and funny. And I think that had to come through. And you read a chapter or you read a book through its title. So in some ways the title is very important, which comes to El Mal de la Taiga. We could have called it the disease in the taiga or the taiga disease, but first of all it sounds like tiger. Then wait a minute, who the tiger's disease? What's going on? But anyway, but no, the thing is that, obviously syndrome is so perfect because, first of all, I was thinking of the China syndrome, which of course has all the implications of capitalism and its corruption, the technology, ecology, all that sort of problem, ecological disaster. Great. So the idea of syndrome and of course it's a disease. So, so you see these changes, so-called changes are really just, they're translations. It's like writing the text. So that it is as impactful as it is in the original.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with balance, and Jill and I have talked about this a lot, is just that because everything, by necessity has to be changed up and muddled around, then there's sort of an aspect of, well, we're losing this, so we're putting something else in, sort of a constant push and pull with that. And it's not always the exact same thing because sometimes you can't or you don't want to for whatever reason because of how the different languages function, but then maybe in the next paragraph, maybe it's repetition of something else, but you want to hold that repetition. One of the challenges was definitely the word that, which, yeah, that was a bit, we all talked about them in the lab. It's a huge one. It's one little word, but it was a huge issue.
When I first looked at the text,
Yeah.
I said,
So many
Aviva,
that's,
there's too
so
many damn that's there.
Yeah.
Hey, that.
And there were, and I mean, the problem is, of course, that in English, we just have one that, and in Spanish, you have multiple. So what in Spanish would be 3 different words in one sentence was sometimes ending up being the same word 3 times very quickly. Mm-hmm. And yet at the same time, the use of K in the Spanish is indispensable.
Absolutely.
It's,
Yes.
you know, that's everything. It's so much of the book because it's this being told that this happened, that, you know, so it cannot be taken away, but it read really heavy in English because we use that just all over the place. So that I thought was tiny but huge.
And it was so important that, for me at least, that you kept it exactly as it was in the Spanish, because this indirect speech is just is central, it's fundamental for the story. I wanted to emphasize mediation, the filtering of information, how knowledge is being produced at every stage of the story. And so in order to do that in Spanish, you use K. Right? This is indirect speech, and there is no other way around that. But then, there were too many that's.
But it was very important to have that.
I did a text search at one point and just started taking them out.
On the other hand, I'm very happy that you have actually caught my sense of humor. People don't believe that, but I'm with you.
I know.
I wanted to ask you, Cristina, the translators, whether you collaborated this time around. You surprised us last time with the Ilia Crest because you did collaborate a lot, right?
Yeah. Last year, the Feminist Press published the Ilia Crest, translated by Sarah Booker. And just as I worked with Jill and Aviva very closely in the translation, I did the same with Sarah. The Ilia Crest is a novel that I had published in Spanish originally in 2003. And so many years had passed from the publication, the original publication, to the moment of the translation. And so when I was reading the English version, I thought that if I were writing that book at this point, I would have added some more paragraphs. And just the thought crossed my mind. And obviously. And I talked to the editor, to Lauren at the Feminist Press, and she said, well, it's your book, you know. You can do whatever you want. And I said, you shouldn't say that. Take good ideas in my mind. And so I did. I added a series of paragraphs. I altered some sentences. And in all that, I wrote originally in English. And then it went back into the Spanish. So the situation has become really interesting now because the book is being republished this year in Mexico, and so they had to translate the paragraphs that I had added in English. Now they've been translated back into Spanish. And the book, it's kind of like the same, but not necessarily so. It's been updated in a radical way, I suppose. But my idea was that I had to be true to the moment of the reading. I had to be true to the spirit of the book. And I do believe that writing is a living entity and is never finalized. If I were able to, I would be writing these books forever. And thankfully, I'm not able to do that, and I have to change from book to book. And so that happened with that Ilia Crest. And with these, we worked very closely. We were emailing each other almost daily at times.
We were pestering her, basically.
Yeah.
And I remember the day that we came out, you came up with this tongue to tongue. I was like, man, this is exactly what I wanted to say. This is how it has to sound like in English. And we had several of those findings throughout the process. So it was fun. It was complicated, complex, I should say. It was, but it was all in all a very friendly exchange. And I think we all were open about suggestions. They came from all over the place, and a lot of work, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. Did you, by the way, did you translate the English of the Iliad Crest, those added paragraphs, back into Spanish or not?
No, I didn't.
Someone else.
Someone else did.
And how do you feel about that?
Why?
The short answer is I was extremely busy, and I didn't have time, and the press was on a very tight deadline, and so they needed that like for yesterday, and I'm like, I just can't do it. And but I think all in all, the translator did a good job. I had a chance to go over that, so.
The other thing I was going to say, that what you said after you read the translation, our translation, you said, you know, in some ways I'm finally understanding this novel. Which shows that you were still involved in writing it, right? And the other thing that you said, which relates, actually it seems more alive to me now. What you mentioned, that far away, that you had to make it as far away as possible. That in some ways you were also thinking of it in English a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
And it's curious because a couple of times we ran into phrases like para decirlo menos, to say the least, which is something which we say much more, or just say it's very common in English, no?
Mm-hmm.
And even though we say it in Spanish too, I think it sort of comes from English a little bit. So
No,
things like that.
This is something really interesting to me. It's been kind of like a shocking finding. That many of these books, the books that have been are in translation now, I conceived of them in this country while working and living in English, while reading a lot of literature in English, and many of the references and many of the authors that I was reading very carefully were authors that belong to traditions that are not necessarily linked or that linked to Latin American literature. So what happened to me when I first started to talk about the Iliad Crest in translation into English was that the questions and the conversations were so much like the ones that I had hoped I could have had in Spanish, but never had, because it was read with different eyes. It was inscribed in a different tradition, and the reading was good, and it was very fruitful and all that, but it was not necessarily the one that I had in mind. But now that the book was in translation, it seems to me that the book was kind of coming back to its original language. So I had thought of it while maintaining a conversation with certain experimental tradition in the United States, and I think many of the clues responded to that interest, which might have been kind of obscure for readers reading in Spanish and in the Mexican tradition or Latin American tradition. And I think the same thing is kind of happening with the Taiga, and this is the Taiga Syndrome.
Right.
And I became aware of this situation in a conversation about the Iliad Crest in a university in San Francisco. And one of the professors there said, well, this resembles, or it reminds me of, and he mentioned 2 or 3 authors, and I was, well, exactly. I mean, those were the ones that I was trying to engage with, and just it was so clear and so direct that so the very idea of translation, of what is the original language of a book, came totally into place. So perhaps this is a translation of a translation, and we are the original languagers.
Now we can open it up to the public and see if anyone has questions. And we have a microphone going around.
Can you just tell us what those 2 books were that the professor noted?
Let me see. One, it was mostly poetry. I do read a lot of poetry. I mostly read poetry, I should say. And I don't wanna lie to you, and I'm bad with titles, but they were poets. It must have been something like Linka Jinian. It must have been something like Ray Armantrout. That kind of West Coast experimental writing. Yeah.
I have a question.
question about translating senses, because I think something that's very interesting in your work and in a lot of Mexican work that I think is sort of an indigenous thing is the capturing senses. So you show the visuals in the book, you talk about the sound and the importance of sort of feeling the sound in your body, and I think that multiple senses sort of come out in both the translation and the Spanish. And I wonder if all of you could talk a little bit about translating senses, because I think that's another, language is one thing and it's oral and guttural, but translating that, I guess, into written word and then translating it from languages is a very
Well, you're going back
interesting skill.
You're going back to the original discussion of translation, which goes all the way back to St. Jerome. This idea, and it had to do with biblical translation, that they, rather that to really bring out the true meaning of the book, not word for word, but sense for sense. So that this is like a foundational idea in the discourse on translation to begin with. So
And that's especially important for someone like me. I believe in the writing is an embodied practice. It's not something that we do right here. It's something that we're doing with a whole body, and perception is absolutely essential right there. Touching those points, investigating the language that might convey and might make these points shareable with others. I think that's very much the challenge of every writing practice.
I also think it's part of what made this translation really fun, was that it kind of has that double translation aspect where you have to be thinking about these different elements, and it goes back to what Jill was saying about preserving kind of the impact, because I think that senses is sort of about how it hits you and where it hits you as a reader as well. So I think that is definitely part of what made it an interesting translation, was thinking about that. And I think there was a lot of times where, you feel it in your body while you're translating it and while you're reading it, and like paying attention to that as a translator, of like kind of how am I feeling this is definitely a different experience. It was a nice change from other academic work that I was doing at the time, was that this was so visceral.
Well, in some way, it's the essential academic work in some way, because it's really, it's the closest reading you can give, and this is one of the things where academe has been very slow to realize how essential to the humanities translation is in the concept of its relationship to reading. But I was just thinking of sense for sense, and one of the problems that we had, which is a huge one, there's, because throughout the book there are certain sentences which are echoed from time to time. They're repeated, and they sort of really have to do a lot with the thrust of the book, which you sort of understand but don't understand, but you do understand. And so one of those kind of sentences was, "Cuando decimos adiós, ¿qué es lo que saludamos en realidad?" Now think about that. What does she really mean? What is the sense? So we went through a lot of different versions of that, right?
Yeah.
And
I think we ended up going back to one of our earliest versions. We doubled around.
And you often do that,
yeah.
which is one thing that I think you've noticed, that you sometimes go back to an original version. But what we said there, and you might say, what are we letting in when we say goodbye? Okay. So which is sort of metonymically. Letting in is kind of a metonymic relationship to saludar, because you greet, and some. But it's very interesting. It was I thought it was quite difficult, and it's challenging.
And I'm just going to give you a quick example while we get the microphone. One word that really captivated me was entrecortadamente, which is an adverb, and you translate it as breathlessly. It's an adverb with rhythm. I thought it was very powerful. The whole idea of like entrecortadamente versus breathlessly, which is what you embody in that. It's the same concept, right?
You know who taught us that? Borges. Borges taught many writers things, and he taught. Well, I learned a lot when I looked at his translation of Virginia Woolf, because he translates basically. He realized that English is so much more elegant in terms of adverbs, because we always have a heavy mente in Spanish, right? So basically, he would translate the adverb into an adjective to avoid that mente. So, for example, I think the sentence was, she grinned at him triumphantly. He said, le hacían muecas triunfales. You see, and it's much more elegant and tighter. So you see that, but that's very interesting that you brought that example, because that's one of those grammatical problems that's very strong between English and Spanish. I mean, very problematic.
Albert?
I'd like to hear your take on, usually, at least in my case, I always say that you're supposed to read a book if you can in the language that it was written originally. But a translation is like rewriting a book, and sometimes, for example, to put an example, in Memorias de Adriano by Cortázar, from the French to Spanish, it's so beautifully translated that I'm pretty sure that it's like reading a different book. What is your take on this? Shall we read you in English? Shall I read it in Spanish? Is it two different versions of the same?
Yeah. I've done some translating myself, and I've learned a lot from that experience. I truly believe that a translation is a version, is an autonomous, independent version of the book. And in this case, and in the case of Ilia Kress with Sarah Booker's translation, I was recommending everybody to read both Spanish and English, and it had nothing to do with the market. I swear. But the work of the translator is just that there is this faithfulness, but at the same time, this radical transformation that when it is done as beautifully as Jill and Aviva have done it, and as in such a complex way, getting to the heart of the matter. I was not kidding when I said at the end that I was finally understanding some other aspects of the book, in which I think that's when a translation is quite successful. They are giving me a gift. I'm receiving a new book. It's related to mine in very precise ways, in very faithful ways, right? But at the same time, it is a totally different experience. So now that I've been reading this book out loud in English in some of these readings, I'm always taken aback by things that I was not expecting. I'm like, wow, yeah, and finding the new version enticing and alluring and teaching me something about my own writing that I didn't notice, that I hadn't been able to notice, had not been because of the process of translation and the conversation that came with it. So I'm absolutely grateful to these two, and as I said earlier, I just adore them, and the conversation was fun and was rewarding, and I don't know what you think about it.
Well, two things. I wanted to mention the Hadrian, but yeah, I mean, and of course Aviva knows this, that in The Subversive Scribe, that one of the main points I make is that translation, if it is a good translation, it fulfills a potential. In other words, it brings out something that is in the original, but in a different way, and then it sort of kind of gives it a life afterwards. But you have to think that maybe all writing is translation. I mean, Hadrian, after all, is wonderful. Marguerite Yourcenar, she wrote it in French, and I read it in English, which I think she collaborated with her partner, Grace Frick, her name was, who did the English version. And you know, but when I was reading that book, I was thinking, well, this feels like it's Hadrian. I feel like I'm hearing the voice of Hadrian. You know, I mean, curiously, even though it's English, but because, you know, also we always, when we see these British films, you know, these that are based on, you know, Shakespeare and stuff. Yeah, I mean, Shakespeare is based on Roman stories and stuff like that. But, you know, it's always the Brits playing the ancient Greeks and stuff. But nonetheless, it felt to me like I was hearing Hadrian as well as Marguerite Yourcenar, even though she had written it in French. So, I mean, you know, in some ways, writing is a translation of a translation, you know, because there's always a text underneath, see, and so that's part of the idea, I think.
I do read a lot in translation, by the way, I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
But a lot in translation. Actually, the best book I've read this year, and I highly recommend, is by this Danish author, Madame Nielsen, and the title of the book is The Endless Summer. And one of the reasons why I love this book is the quality of the sentences is just so amazing. These are long sentences, like almost like Spanish-like sentences, with a wonderful use of punctuation signs and the sound and the rhythm. Everything is perfect. And I was thinking, I'm reading this is a translation. I have no idea, I don't speak Danish, of course. I have no idea about how the sentences are like or sound like in the original language, but the translation as such is just, I don't want to read it in Danish. Just uses it. Well, because I don't know Danish, but
And I was just going to say that, yeah, it was a real privilege to be working with an author who wasn't possessive over her writing. And a lot of times when we would send something, I would be kind of predicting like, oh, we may have gone too far with this. This is where there's going to be an issue. And maybe there would probably be an issue, but it was somewhere completely different. It was always surprising, kind of the spots where it wasn't like, oh, a lot of liberties were taken here. This is what she's going to send back and be like, this is not what I wrote. And that was not really something that that you did. And it was more like, oh, you know, something else. So it was always kind of a surprising read from Cristina as well. And so whenever I would, you know, assume something, I was pretty much wrong with that. But which was great, because then there was a certain liberty with that of how we were able to experiment as well as translators.
But you know, I was not always like this. I have to tell you, I have to be honest. When a novel of mine was translated back in 2003, No One Will See Me Cry, I just gave my translator such a hard time because I had not translated myself anything. I hadn't gone through the process of translation, and I was way more possessive about the meaning of things. I was not that bad, I'm exaggerating. But before I embarked in this translation, and also the Crest, I had translated some works by Vanessa Place and Robert Peterman, and I translated recently the work by this poet, Fred Moten. And so I had myself gone through that. And that has just changed so much, the way in which I think of my own work, of my relationship to language, and just the carefulness, devotion that goes through every single decision in this process of translation. So, you know, it's good.
The right moment, yeah.
Well, we learned a lot though from you. I mean, and many there were points that you made also that helped us. I mean, for example, indirect discourse, it should be a little strange, and the emphasizing that was really important.
Well, I think please join me in thanking our great panelists.
Yeah, I can only, can you hear me?
Oh.
Wait a second. There we go. I can only say the same thing. Thank you, Manuel, for moderating that wonderful, wild panel. Thanks to all of you for your great work on behalf of literature. I'm Rob Casper. I'm the head of the Poetry and Literature Center. And before I let you go, there's just a couple of things I want to tell you. First of all, I'm sure you all, like me, want to get a copy of the Taiga Syndrome. It is in the back. I'm sure that all three of our great writers, translators, will sign copies, so please get one, get more than one, give them to everyone you know. Secondly, you should have a survey. We'd love to have you fill this out. It's really helpful for us to know what kind of programs we should be doing and how we can improve upon our programs. So you met Anya and Catalina, and Ann Holmes is right there. She was with the mic. You can give the surveys to any one of us. We'd love to have your comments. Especially, we'd love to know how you might have already engaged with the library. There's a little bit in the bottom right that you can fill out. Finally, we hope to see you back here very soon. On Wednesday, November 7th, at the same time, in the same room, we have an event co-sponsored by the Poetry and Literature Center and the Hispanic Division featuring Uruguayan poetry, and we hope you can make it. So until then, enjoy.